They thought he was just a confused, senile old man wandering in from the rain. His coat was torn, his hands shook, and he ordered nothing but a cup of hot water and a single slice of toast. The other customers mocked him. The manager wanted him thrown out. But James, a waitress drowning in her own debt, treated him like royalty. When he left a crumpled $5 bill on the table as a tip, she didn't get angry. She chased him down. What she said to him in that alleyway didn't just break his heart. It forced the wealthiest man in Boston to call his lawyer at 3 and rewrite his entire billion-dollar will. And the reason why, it wasn't because of what she did. It was because of who she turned out to be. The rain in Boston didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Inside the Bluebird diner, the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing flicker that James Bennett had been trying to ignore for 6 hours. "James, table 4 needs a refill, and stop daydreaming." The voice of her manager, Rick, cut through the clatter of silverware. Rick was a man who believed that if you had time to breathe, you had time to scrub the grout with a toothbrush. "On it, Rick," James said, wiping her hands on her apron. She caught her reflection in the stainless steel coffee urn, dark circles under her eyes, hair fraying from her ponytail. She looked 10 years older than 26. She grabbed the coffee pot and moved to table 4. As she poured, her mind drifted to the letter sitting in her locker in the back room. Final notice. It was from the hospital. Her 5-year-old daughter, Lily, had been in remission for 6 months, but the bills from the chemotherapy were like a noose that kept tightening every day. $12,000. That was the immediate balance due to keep the collection agency from garnishing her wages. She had $42 in tips in her pocket. "Thanks, sweetie." The trucker at table 4 grunted, not looking up from his phone. James forced a smile. "You're welcome. Let me know if you need pie." She moved through the diner with the muscle memory of someone who had walked these floors 1,000 times. The Bluebird was the kind of place where people came to forget, or to wait for a bus that was running late. It wasn't a place for billionaires. It wasn't a place for hope. At the corner booth sat a group of businessmen in suits, their ties loosened, laughing loudly about a merger that had just pushed 1,000 people out of their jobs. James had served them 3 rounds of scotch. They were loud, rude, and tipped poorly, but she kept her head down. "Hey, honey," one of them shouted, snapping his fingers. "This steak is cold. Take it back." It was the 3rd time he'd sent it back. The steak was steaming. "I'm so sorry, sir," James said, her voice steady. "I'll have the chef put it on the grill again." "Don't bother," the man sneered, checking his Rolex, a Submariner that cost more than James's entire life. "Just take it off the bill and bring us another round. Chop, chop." James nodded, taking the plate. As she walked away, she heard one of them whisper, "Pathetic. Imagine doing this for a living." She swallowed the lump in her throat. She didn't do this for a living. She did this for Lily. She did this so her little girl could have fresh sheets and medicine that didn't taste like chalk. James Bennett used to study literature. She used to dream of writing novels. Now, she wrote orders on a notepad and prayed her car would start in the morning. She pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen, the heat hitting her face. "He sent it back again?" The cook, Manny, asked, shaking his head. "He wants it off the bill," James said, scraping the perfectly good steak into the bin. "Rich pricks," Manny muttered. The bell on the front door jingled. A gust of cold wind swept through the diner, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and exhaust. James turned to see the new customer. He stood in the doorway, dripping wet. He wore a heavy wool coat that looked like it had been bought 3 decades ago and dragged through a gutter. A flat cap was pulled low over his eyes, and he leaned heavily on a wooden cane. He looked frail, like a strong wind might knock him over. He looked lost. "Hey, we're not a shelter," Rick shouted from behind the counter. "Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, Pops. Buy something or get out." The old man flinched, his hand gripping the cane tighter. James felt a flash of anger. She stepped out from behind the counter before Rick could say another word. "It's okay, Rick. I've got him," she said firmly. She walked over to the man, offering a gentle smile. "Hi there. Ignore him. He's just grumpy because his football team lost. Come on in. Let's get you out of the cold." The old man looked up. His eyes were a startling shade of icy blue, sharp and piercing beneath bushy white brows. For a second, James felt like he was scanning her soul, reading the final notice letter in her mind. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice raspy. "Right this way." She led him to a booth near the radiator. "I'm James. Can I get you some coffee to warm you up?" On the house. The old man sat down slowly, groaning as his joints settled. "Just hot water, please. And do you have dry toast? I can't stomach much." "Coming right up," James said. She didn't know it yet, but the man sitting at booth 6 was not a homeless drifter. He was Maddox P. Sterling, the owner of Sterling Industries, a man worth $4.2 billion. And he wasn't there for the toast. He was there because he was dying, and he was looking for the one thing his money hadn't been able to buy. Maddox Sterling watched the girl walk away. His hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the Parkinson's that he had kept hidden from the board of directors for 2 years. He looked around the diner. It was filthy. The floor was sticky. The air smelled of grease, and the manager was a loudmouth bully. It was perfect. Maddox had spent the last 50 years in boardrooms, surrounded by sharks in Italian suits. He had a son, Richard, who was currently waiting for him to die so he could sell off the company for parts and buy a private island in the Mediterranean. He had a daughter, Caroline, who hadn't called him in 3 years unless her credit card was declined. Yesterday, his doctor had given him the news. Pancreatic cancer. Aggressive. 3 months. Maybe 4. When he got home to his 20-room mansion in Beacon Hill, he found Richard there, drinking his scotch. Richard hadn't asked how the appointment went. He had asked if Maddox had finalized the trust fund transfer. That was the moment Maddox realized he had failed. He had built an empire, but he had raised wolves. So tonight, he had put on his gardener's old coat. He left his wallet in the safe, taking only a single $100 bill and a $5 bill. He walked out the back gate, bypassing his security detail, and took a taxi to the poorest part of town. He wanted to see if there was any decency left in the world. He wanted to see if anyone would treat a nothing man with kindness. He watched James return with a steaming mug and a plate. "Here we go," she said, placing it down gently. She hadn't brought just hot water. She had brought a cup of tea with honey and lemon, and the toast was buttered with a side of scrambled eggs. I didn't order eggs," Maddox said, feigning confusion. "I don't have the money for eggs, miss." "It's a mistake from the kitchen," James lied smoothly, winking. "Chef made too much. If you don't eat it, we just have to throw it out. You'd be doing me a favor." Maddox looked at the eggs. He knew the kitchen hadn't made a mistake. He saw the manager watching like a hawk. This girl was risking her job, or paying for this out of her own pocket. "You're very kind," Maddox said softly. "It's just eggs," she shrugged. "My dad used to say, 'Empty stomachs make for heavy hearts.' Eat up." Maddox froze. Empty stomachs make for heavy hearts. He hadn't heard that phrase in 40 years. "Your father?" Maddox asked, his voice catching. "Is he a writer?" James's smile faltered, a shadow crossing her face. No. He was a factory worker. He passed away a long time ago, but he liked to talk. I see, Maddox said. He took a bite of the eggs. They were greasy and over-salted. They tasted better than the lobster thermidor he'd had at the Ritz the night before. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the diner. The businessman at the corner booth had knocked over a glass of water. "Hey, waitress!" the man with the Rolex shouted. "Look at this mess! Get over here!" James sighed. "Excuse me," she whispered to Maddox. "Duty calls." Maddox watched as she rushed over. The businessman, whose face was flushed with alcohol, pointed at the wet table. "You put the glass too close to the edge. This is your fault. My pants are soaked." "I'm sorry, sir," James said, grabbing a rag. "I'll clean it up." "You bet you will," the man sneered. He stood up, towering over her. "And you're paying for the dry cleaning. This is an Armani suit." "Sir, it was an accident," James said, her voice trembling slightly. "An accident." "No, it's incompetence," the man spat. "You're a screw-up. That's why you're wiping tables at 30 while I'm running companies." The diner went silent. Rick, the manager, looked away, too cowardly to intervene with a paying customer. Maddox gripped his cane. His knuckles turned white. The old Maddox, the shark of Wall Street, would have crushed this man. He would have bought the building and evicted him in 5 minutes. But he was just an old man in a frayed coat tonight. He waited. He wanted to see what she would do. James stood up straight. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She looked the man in the eye. "I may wipe tables, sir," she said, her voice quiet but piercing. "But at least I don't treat people like dirt just to make myself feel tall. I'll bring you some napkins. You can clean the rest yourself." She turned around and walked away. The businessman spluttered, his face turning purple. "You're fired. I'm telling your boss, Rick." "Leave her alone," Maddox said. The voice was low, but it carried the authority of a man who had commanded armies of lawyers. The businessman turned to look at Maddox. He laughed. "Who said that? The hobo! Shut up, Grandpa, before I buy this dump and turn it into a parking lot." Maddox stared at him. For a second, the mask slipped. The steel gaze of Maddox Sterling drilled into the drunk man. "You couldn't afford the asphalt, son." The businessman blinked, unsettled by the old man's intensity. He muttered something and sat back down, his friends pulling him back. James returned to Maddox's table. She looked shaken. "Thank you," she whispered. "But please, don't get involved. I can't afford to lose this job." "You shouldn't have to tolerate that," Maddox said. "I tolerate what I have to," she said, checking her watch. "I have a little girl. Pride is a luxury I can't afford right now." Maddox nodded slowly. "Pride is a luxury." He finished his tea. It was time for the test. The diner began to clear out. The rain had turned into a drizzle. Maddox signaled for the check. James brought it over. "Don't worry about the eggs," she whispered. "Just the tea and toast." The bill was $4.50. Maddox reached into his pocket. He pulled out the $5 bill. He had a $100 bill hidden in his other pocket, the one he planned to give her if she passed the test. But the test wasn't about giving a big tip. It was about seeing how she reacted to a bad one. He placed the $5 bill on the table. "Keep the change," Maddox said grumpily, avoiding her eyes. He stood up, acting as though he had just bestowed a great gift upon her. James looked at the bill. $4.50 for the food. That left a 50-cent tip. She had served him eggs she paid for. She had defended him against the manager. She had treated him with dignity. And he left her 50 cents. Maddox watched her face closely. He expected annoyance. He expected an eye roll. He expected her to mutter, cheapskate under her breath as he walked away. That's what his son Richard would have done. That's what his daughter would have done. James looked at the money. Then she looked at Maddox, who was struggling to button his coat with his shaking hands. She didn't sigh. She didn't look angry. She smiled. A genuine, soft smile. "Thank you, sir," she said. "Have a safe night." Maddox was stunned. She thanked him? He turned and shuffled toward the door. He felt a pang of guilt. Maybe the test was too cruel. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the cold, damp alleyway. He needed to call his driver, who was waiting 2 blocks away. He walked about 20 paces when he heard the door open behind him. Footsteps splashed on the wet pavement. "Sir, sir, wait." It was James. Maddox stopped and turned around. "Here it comes," he thought. "Now she's going to tell me off. Now she's going to throw the 50 cents at me." James caught up to him, breathless. She wasn't holding the 50 cents. She was holding a small, white styrofoam box and the $5 bill he had just given her. "You forgot this," she said, holding out the money. Maddox frowned. "I told you to keep the change." "I know," James said, pressing the bill into his trembling hand. "But I can't take this. You need it more than I do." Maddox stared at the bill in his hand. I don't understand. It's your tip." "It's $5, James said gently. "It might buy you breakfast tomorrow, or a bus fare to a shelter." She held up the styrofoam box. "And I packed up some pie for you. It's apple. Rick was going to throw it out anyway." Maddox felt a lump form in his throat the size of a golf ball. The wind bit at his face, but he felt a warmth spreading through his chest that he hadn't felt in years. "Why?" Maddox asked, his voice cracking. "I'm just a rude old man who left you 50 cents. Why are you helping me?" James pulled her cardigan tighter around herself. The neon sign of the diner buzzed above them, casting a pink light on her tired face. "Because," she said, "my husband, he died in a car accident 2 years ago. Before he died, we were struggling. There was a week where we had to choose between gas for the car or milk for the baby. A stranger at a gas station saw him counting pennies and paid for his full tank. He never got the man's name." She looked Maddox in the eyes. "That man saved us that week. I promised myself that if I ever saw someone who was counting pennies, I'd pay it forward. You aren't rude, sir. You're just having a hard time. And hard times shouldn't strip a man of his dignity." Maddox looked down at the $5. Then he looked at the pie. He had come here to test her. He thought he was the judge. He realized now that he was the one being judged, and for the first time in his life, he felt unworthy. He gripped the cane. This was it. This was the moment. "What is your full name, James?" he asked. "James Jenkins." "Jenkins?" Maddox's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Did your father work at the Sterling Steel Mill in 1995? James stepped back, surprised. "Yes, how did you know that? He was a foreman. Frank Jenkins." Maddox felt the blood drain from his face. Frank Jenkins, the man who had led the strike in 95, the man Maddox had fired to make an example, the man who had lost his pension, his home, and eventually his life to stress-induced heart failure. This was Frank Jenkins' daughter, and she was trying to feed the man who had destroyed her family. Maddox's hand went to his chest. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. He began to cough, a deep, rattling cough that bent him double. "Sir, are you okay?" James dropped the box and grabbed his arm. Maddox waved her off, gasping for air. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. If she knew who he was, she would hate him, and he couldn't bear that. Not when she was the only person who had looked at him with kindness in a decade. "I'm fine," he wheezed. Just the cold. He straightened up. He looked at the $5 in his hand. James, he said, his voice regaining that steel undertone. I am going to take this pie, and I am going to take this money. But I want you to remember this night. I will, she said, confused. I want you to remember that you tipped the scales, he said enigmatically. Go back inside, it's cold. Will you be okay? I'll be better than I've been in years, Maddox said. He watched her walk back into the diner. As soon as the door closed, Maddox pulled out his burner phone. He dialed a number. Halloway, he barked into the phone. Mr. Sterling, it's 11 p.m., his lawyer's sleepy voice answered. I don't care what time it is. Get the jet ready, and call the partners. We are rewriting the will. Tonight. Sir, is this about Richard? It's about everything, Robert. I found her. I found Frank's girl, and Robert... Yes, sir. Find out how much debt she has. Every penny. Mortgage, student loans, medical bills. I want the number on my desk by the time I get to the office. Maddox hung up. He looked at the styrofoam box in his hand. Apple pie. He walked toward the corner where his black Maybach pulled out from the shadows. The driver opened the door. Home, sir? No, Maddox said, getting in. To the office. We have work to do. But the drama was just beginning. Maddox didn't know that his son, Richard, had a tracker on the car. And Richard wasn't about to let his inheritance go to a waitress without a fight. The next morning, the reality of James's life came crashing back down. The magic of the previous night, the strange old man, the shared pie, the feeling of connection, evaporated the moment she checked her mailbox. The final warning from the hospital was there. Immediate payment required, $12 out of $400. If she didn't pay by Friday, they would send it to collections, and her credit would be ruined. If her credit was ruined, no landlord in Boston would rent to her. She and Lily would be on the street. James went to work at the Bluebird with a knot in her stomach, so tight she could barely breathe. You're late, Rick barked as she tied her apron. And table 6 is already complaining about the coffee. Sorry, Rick, she mumbled. The morning rush was brutal. James was running on 3 hours of sleep. Every time the door chimed, she jumped, hoping against hope that the old man, Maddox, would walk in so she could see he was okay. But he never came. At 10:30 a.m., the diner quieted down. The door opened, but it wasn't a hungry customer. 2 men in charcoal grey suits walked in. They didn't look like they belonged in a place that sold meatloaf for $8.99. One of them was holding a leather briefcase. James's heart stopped. She recognized the look. Debt collectors. They had found her at work. This was it. The humiliation was about to begin. Rick saw them and immediately puffed out his chest. Can I help you, gentlemen? We're looking for James Bennett, the older of the 2 men said. He had silver hair and a kind but serious face. This was Robert Halloway, Maddox Sterling's personal attorney for 40 years. Rick smirked and pointed a thumb at James. She's over there. What did she do? Steal something? James froze, gripping the coffee pot. I can explain, she stammered, thinking of the hospital bill. I just need a little more time. Halloway ignored Rick and walked straight to James. He took off his hat. Miss Bennett? He asked. Yes, she whispered, bracing herself for the paperwork, for the garnishment of her wages. My name is Robert Halloway. I am the executor of the estate of Maddox P. Sterling. James blinked. Who? The gentleman you served last night, Halloway said gently. The man you gave the pie to. James's confusion deepened. Maddox? Is he okay? Is he in trouble? Halloway's face fell. He sighed, a heavy, mournful sound. Mr. Sterling passed away early this morning, Miss Bennett. His heart gave out in his sleep. The coffee pot slipped from James's hand. It shattered on the floor, sending hot liquid splashing over her sneakers. "He's dead," she gasped. "But I just saw him. He said he would be better." "He was better," Holloway said, "because of you. He died peacefully. But before he passed, he gave me strict instructions to come here immediately." Rick, who was listening in, laughed nervously. Wait. Maddox Sterling? The billionaire? You're telling me that bum from last night was the richest man in Boston?" Holloway turned his gaze to Rick. It was a look that could freeze water. Mr. Sterling was not a bum. He was a giant of industry, and he had very specific opinions about the management of this establishment. Holloway turned back to James. He placed the briefcase on the counter and clicked the latches open. "Miss Bennett, Mr. Sterling requested that I handle a few matters for you. First." He pulled out a cashier's check. He handed it to her. James looked at the numbers. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped it. The check was made out to Boston General Hospital. The amount was $12,400. How did he know?" James cried, tears spilling over. "I never told him the amount." "Maddox Sterling knew everything he wanted to know," Holloway said. "He had me call the hospital administration at 2 a.m. Your daughter's treatment is paid in full for the next 2 years. You don't owe them a penny." James covered her mouth, sobbing. The weight that had been crushing her chest for months vanished in an instant. "Why?" she choked out. "I just gave him pie." "You gave him dignity," Holloway corrected. "But that is not all." He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with red wax. "This is a formal summons. Mr. Sterling has named you as a primary beneficiary in his last will and testament. The reading is scheduled for this Friday at the Sterling Industries headquarters." The diner went dead silent. Rick's jaw hit the floor. The customers stopped chewing. "Beneficiary?" James asked, wiping her eyes. "You mean, he left me money?" "I cannot discuss the details until the reading," Holloway said professionally. "But I suggest you take the rest of the week off. You will need to prepare." Holloway reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "If anyone, and I mean anyone, bothers you before Friday, you call this number. Do you understand?" James nodded, too stunned to speak. Holloway tipped his hat and walked out. Rick stood there, pale as a ghost. He looked at James, then at the shattered coffee pot. I'll clean that up, James," Rick stammered, grabbing a mop. "You go home, take the week. Take 2 weeks." James walked out of the diner into the bright morning sun. She clutched the check to her chest. She didn't know that the check was the smallest part of what was coming. And she didn't know that by accepting that envelope, she had just painted a target on her back. While James was crying tears of relief, a very different scene was playing out in the penthouse office of Sterling Industries. Richard Sterling was throwing a glass of scotch against the wall. It shattered, soaking the expensive Persian rug. "What do you mean the accounts are frozen?" he screamed at his personal accountant. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling," the accountant stammered, cowering behind a chair. "The executors have locked everything down. Holloway says no transfers can be made until after the will reading on Friday." Richard paced the room like a caged tiger. He was 45 years old, handsome in a slick, predatory way, but his eyes were empty. He had spent his entire life waiting for his father to die. He had debts of his own, gambling debts, bad investments in cryptocurrency, and a lifestyle that cost $3 million a month to maintain. He needed that inheritance. "It's that waitress, isn't it?" Richard hissed. "The one Holloway went to see." He picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Get me frantic. I want everything on a woman named James Bennett. Address, history, dirty laundry. If she jaywalked in 2012, I want to know about it. Richard wasn't just going to fight the will. He was going to destroy the beneficiary. 2 days later, James was at the park with Lily. It was the first time in months she had been able to sit on a park bench without calculating the cost of groceries in her head. Lily was playing in the sandbox, laughing. "Cute kid." The voice came from behind her. James turned. A man in a navy blue suit stood there. He wore sunglasses, even though it was cloudy. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like a shark. "Can I help you?" James asked, instinctively moving to stand between the man and Lily. "I'm Richard Sterling," the man said, taking off his sunglasses. "Maddox's son." James's breath caught. "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your father was a wonderful man." Richard laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "My father was a senile old bat who lost his mind in the last 24 hours of his life. And you are the vulture who swooped in to pick his bones." James stiffened. "I didn't ask for anything. He came to me." "Cut the act," Richard snapped. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. "I know who you are, James. Or should I say, James Jenkins?" James went cold. "I know your father was Frank Jenkins," Richard sneered. "The union trash who tried to cripple my father's company back in the 90s. He was a loser, and he raised a loser. You think this is some kind of poetic justice? Revenge for your daddy?" "My father was a good man," James said, her voice shaking but firm. "And this has nothing to do with him." "It has everything to do with him," Richard yelled. A few parents at the playground turned to look. "You targeted my father. You saw a weak old man, and you played the poor widow card. Well, it's not going to work." He reached into his jacket pocket. James flinched, but he only pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something quickly and tore it out. "Here," he said, shoving the check at her. James looked at it. $50,000. "Take that," Richard said. "That's more money than you'll make in 5 years slinging hash. Take it. Sign a waiver renouncing any claim to the estate and disappear. If you do that, we walk away friends." "And if I don't?" James asked quietly. Richard leaned in close, his cologne overpowering her. "If you don't," he whispered, "I will make sure the whole world knows you're a fraud. I'll drag your name through the mud. I'll tell the press you seduced a dying man. I'll make sure you never get a job in this city again. And I have lawyers who can tie you up in court until that little girl of yours is in college. You won't see a dime of the inheritance for a decade. Can you afford that? Can you afford to fight me?" James looked at the check. $50,000. It was a life-changing amount. It was safety. It was easy. She looked at Lily, who was building a sandcastle. Then she looked at Richard. She saw the same arrogance she had seen in the businessman at the diner, the same belief that people were just things to be bought and sold. Maddox had tipped her $5 to test her integrity. Richard was tipping her $50,000 to buy it. James slowly took the check. Richard smirked. "Smart girl." Rip. James tore the check in half, then in quarters. She let the pieces fall onto the grass. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she had. "And neither was your father. I'll see you at the reading." Richard's face turned purple. His veins bulged in his neck. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "A massive mistake. I will destroy you." "You can try," James said, turning her back on him. "Come on, Lily. Time to go." She picked up her daughter and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest like a sledgehammer. She was terrified. She had no money, no lawyers, and no power. She had just declared war on a billionaire. But as she walked, she remembered Maddox's words in the alleyway. Hard times shouldn't strip a man of his dignity. She wasn't doing this for the money anymore. She was doing it because Maddox Sterling had trusted her to protect something. She didn't know what it was yet, the company, the legacy, the people. But she wasn't going to let a bully like Richard Sterling tear it apart. Friday came. James put on her best black dress, kissed Lily goodbye, and took the bus to the financial district. She looked up at the Sterling Tower. It was 60 stories of glass and steel, piercing the sky. It looked impenetrable. James took a deep breath, clutched her father's old diary in her purse, and walked through the revolving doors. The real test was about to begin. The elevator ride to the 60th floor took 45 seconds, but to James it felt like an eternity. Her hands were sweating. She clutched her purse tight against her side, feeling the outline of her father's old diary through the leather. It was her only shield. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a world of hushed luxury. The carpet was thick, the air smelled of lemon polish and money, and a receptionist who looked like a supermodel directed her to the main conference room. Robert Halloway met her at the door. He looked tired but gave her a reassuring nod. "Ready, James?" he asked softly. "No," she admitted. "Good. Maddox always said that if you're not scared, you're not paying attention." He opened the heavy mahogany doors. The room was massive. A table the size of a bowling lane dominated the center. Seated around it were 20 people, the board of directors, men and women in expensive suits, who controlled the fate of thousands of employees. At the head of the table sat Richard Sterling. He looked smug. Beside him sat a team of 5 lawyers, their briefcases open, stacking documents like bricks in a wall. James took the empty seat at the opposite end. She felt small. She felt like a waitress. "Let's get this farce over with," Richard announced, not bothering to stand. "We all know why we're here." My father was not in his right mind. "Objection," Halloway said, taking his seat next to James. Maddox Sterling was perfectly sane. He gave his legacy to a stranger in a diner. Richard slammed his hand on the table. He was senile, and I have 3 psychiatrists ready to testify that his medication caused hallucinations. Richard stood up and addressed the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, this woman is a grifter." She found a confused old man, fed him some sob story, and manipulated him. If we allow this will to stand, Sterling Industries will be the laughing stock of Wall Street. The stock is already down 4% this morning on the rumors. We need to annul this will, appoint me as CEO, and stabilize the company. The board members nodded. They looked at James with suspicion and disdain. To them, she was a risk, a mistake. "I move to invalidate the will based on mental incompetence," Richard's lead lawyer said smoothly. "Not so fast," Halloway interrupted. He pulled a small remote control from his pocket. "Maddox anticipated this, Richard. That's why he didn't just write a will, he recorded one." Halloway pointed the remote at the massive screen behind Richard. The screen flickered to life. The room went silent. Maddox Sterling appeared on the screen. He was sitting in his library, wearing a velvet robe. He looked frail, but his blue eyes, the same eyes that had pierced James in the diner, were sharp as diamonds. "Hello, Richard," the video Maddox said. Richard stiffened, his face losing color. "If you are watching this, I am gone," Maddox continued, his voice amplified through the surround sound speakers. "And if I know you, you are currently trying to tell this board that I lost my mind. You are probably claiming I was senile. You are probably insulting Miss Bennet." A nervous chuckle ran through the room. Richard glared at the screen. "I have never been more clear-headed," Maddox said. "I am leaving the controlling interest of Sterling Industries, 51% of the shares, to James Bennet. Not because she asked for it, but because she passed the test that you, Richard, failed every single day of your life. On the screen, Maddox leaned forward. I went to that diner looking for nothing. I had $5 in my pocket. I acted rude, I acted poor, and James, she treated me like a king. She gave me her own food. She paid for my mistake. And when I tipped her 50 cents, an insult, she thanked me. Maddox paused, his expression hardening. Richard, do you remember your 16th birthday? I gave you a Porsche. You threw the keys at me because it was the wrong color. Do you remember when you became vice president? You cut the janitorial staff's pension to save a fraction of a percent. You treat people like tools. James treats them like human beings. The silence in the room was deafening. Richard was sweating now. This company builds steel, Maddox said. But steel is useless without a foundation. Integrity is the foundation. Richard, you are a shark. But James is a leader. She has the one thing I couldn't teach you. She has a heart. The screen went black. For a moment, no one moved. Then Richard laughed. It was a desperate, manic sound. Touching, Richard sneered. Truly touching. A moral lesson from the grave. But morals don't run a billion-dollar conglomerate. Look at her. He pointed a shaking finger at James. She's a waitress. She doesn't know what EBITDA is. She doesn't know how to negotiate with China. If you give her this company, it will be bankrupt in 6 months. He turned to the board, his eyes wild. I have a standing offer from Apex Capital. They want to buy Sterling Industries for $60 a share. That makes everyone in this room rich. Right now, we sell, we cash out, and we let the waitress go back to pouring coffee. The board members shifted. Greed lit up their eyes. $60 a share was a massive premium. The offer expires at noon, Richard pressed. Vote with me. Invalidate the will, sell to Apex, and we all win. The chairman of the board, a grey-haired man named Mr. Henderson, looked at James. Ms. Bennett, Henderson said coldly. Richard has a point. You have no experience. If we hand you the reins, the shareholders will revolt. Why shouldn't we sell? James's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood up. Her legs felt weak, but she remembered the wet pavement in the alley. She remembered the look in Maddox's eyes. I don't know about EBITDA, James began, her voice trembling slightly. See, Richard shouted. Quiet! Henderson snapped at Richard. Let her speak. James took a breath. I don't know about global markets, but I know what Apex Capital does. I looked them up last night. They buy companies, strip them for parts, and fire the workers. If you sell to them, you're firing 15,000 loyal employees, 15,000 families. That's business, Richard scoffed. No, James said, her voice growing stronger. That's theft. Maddox didn't build this company to make a quick buck. He built it to build America. She reached into her purse and pulled out the tattered diary. And he didn't leave it to me just because I gave him pie, she said. He left it to me because he owed a debt to my father. The silence in the boardroom was heavy, the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. James stood at the foot of the massive mahogany table, her hand trembling slightly as she clutched the tattered leather notebook. Richard Sterling let out a short, incredulous laugh. It sounded like a bark in the quiet room. He leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the water in his crystal glass, looking at James with pure contempt. Your father? Richard sneered, looking around at the board members as if seeking an audience for his joke. We've already established this, Miss Bennett. You come from a line of factory workers, manual labourers. While that is quaint, I fail to see how the biography of a blue-collar nobody has any relevance to the sale of a billion-dollar conglomerate. He turned his cold gaze back to her. We are discussing high finance, James, not a bedtime story. James felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. Her instinct was to shrink away, to apologize, to return to the invisibility of being a waitress. But then she looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, Maddox's chair. She remembered the weight of his hand on her arm in the alleyway. He wasn't a nobody, James said. Her voice started small, but it found its footing in the silence. And his name wasn't just factory worker. His name was Frank Jenkins. The name landed in the room like a grenade. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, at the far end of the table, Mr. Henderson, the chairman of the board, dropped his pen. It clattered loudly against the wood. Henderson was the oldest man in the room, a fixture at Sterling Industries for 40 years. His face, usually a mask of indifference, went pale. "Frank Jenkins?" Henderson whispered, squinting at James. "The foreman? From the Mill Basin plant?" "Yes," James said, locking eyes with him. "The man who led the safety strike in 1995. A murmur of recognition rippled through the older board members. They remembered 1995. It was the year Sterling Industries almost went under. It was the year of the riots, the year the media camped out on the front lawn. Richard waved his hand dismissively. Ancient history. A troublemaker who tried to hold the company hostage. My father fired him. He crushed that strike. It was one of his greatest victories. "It wasn't a victory," James said, her voice rising. "It was his greatest regret." She opened the diary. The pages were yellowed with age, smelling of old paper and the motor oil her father could never quite scrub off his hands. "You all think Maddox was a ruthless tycoon," James said. "You think he fired my father because he wanted to break the union, but you're wrong. And I have the proof in Maddox's own handwriting, and my father's." She found the page marked with a faded blue ribbon. "My father wrote this entry the night he came home with his box of belongings," James told them. "I was 6 years old. I remember him sitting at the kitchen table, crying. I had never seen him cry before." She lifted the book and began to read. She didn't just read the words. She projected them, letting the pain of a dead man fill the sterile, air-conditioned room. James lowered the book, her vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them away. "Inside that envelope was $5,000, James continued. "It kept a roof over our heads for 6 months. My father never hated Maddox. He pitied him. He told me that Maddox Sterling was a good man trapped in a cage made of gold." She looked directly at Mr. Henderson, then at the other board members. "You forced his hand," she accused gently. The board in 95 prioritized quarterly profits over human safety. You made Maddox the villain so you could keep your dividends. He carried that guilt for 30 years. It ate him alive. And when he met me, when he realized who I was, he saw a chance to finally keep his promise. The room was deathly silent. Richard looked around, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The arrogance was draining from the faces of the board members, replaced by something that looked like shame. "This is ridiculous!" Richard shouted, slamming his fist on the table, shattering the moment. "Sentimental garbage. Who cares what happened 30 years ago? We have an offer today. Apex Capital is waiting. We are talking about $6 billion. He stood up, his face red and vein-popping. "She is manipulating you with a sob story. She has no plan. She has no experience. If you don't sell, this company dies." "The company is already dying," James shot back. "She didn't back down this time." She took a step toward Richard. "It's dying because it has no soul, Richard. You want to sell to Apex? I did my homework. I spent the entire night reading about them. Apex buys legacy companies, loads them with debt, sells off the assets, and fires the workforce. If you sign that paper, you aren't making a deal. You're signing a death warrant for 15,000 jobs, 15,000 families like mine. That's how capitalism works, Richard yelled. Maximize shareholder value. No, James said firmly. That is how greed works. Maddox didn't build this company to strip it for parts. He built it to build America. She turned back to the board. She needed to close this. She needed to show them she wasn't just a daughter with a diary, but a leader with a vision. Richard says I have no plan. He's wrong. James reached into her purse again. This time she didn't pull out a diary. She pulled out a crisp, legal document. I didn't sleep last night, she announced. At 4 a.m. I met with Thomas O'Malley, the head of the Steel Workers Union. We met at the diner. Richard scoffed. You negotiated with the union. They've been threatening to strike for months. Not anymore, James said. I showed them the diary. I showed them that the hatred between the Sterlings and the workers was based on a lie. And we made a deal. She tossed the document onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped in front of Mr. Henderson. It's a 5-year agreement, James explained, her voice clear and commanding. The union agrees to a total wage freeze and a no-strike clause for the next 60 months. In exchange, we don't sell to Apex. Instead, we implement an employee stock ownership plan. We give the workers 20% equity in the company over the next decade. You're giving away the company, Richard screamed. You're insane. I'm investing in it, James corrected him. Mr. Henderson, you know the numbers better than I do. What happens to productivity when workers own what they build? Henderson picked up the document, reading it through his spectacles. Productivity typically rises by 15 to 20%. Waste drops. Turnover virtually disappears. Exactly, James said. Richard wants to give you a quick payout that you'll pay taxes on and forget in a year. I am offering you a company that will dominate the market for the next century because our steel will be built by partners, not just employees. We will have the most loyal, efficient workforce in the industry. She looked at the faces around the table. She saw the wheels turning. These were business people, yes, but they were also human. And for the first time in years, someone was offering them a future that wasn't just about cutting costs. Maddox left me the controlling interest, James said softly. But I can't run this without you. I need this board. But I need a board that remembers what the name Sterling stands for. It stands for quality, it stands for integrity, and it stands for keeping your promises. She took a deep breath. So, here is the choice. You can vote with Richard. You can take the money, fire the workers, and destroy Maddox's legacy for a fast buck. Or, you can vote with me. We keep the company. We honor the workers. And we build something we can actually be proud of. Richard looked at the board members. He saw them looking at the document. He saw them looking at James with a newfound respect. Don't listen to her, Richard pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. She's a waitress. She served me eggs 3 days ago. This is madness. Mr. Henderson slowly took off his glasses. He looked at Richard. Then he looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. Finally, he looked at James. The motion on the table, Henderson said, his voice gravelly but steady, is Richard's proposal to sell the company to Apex Capital. All those in favor? Richard shot his hand up. Yes. Obviously, yes. He looked around. One lawyer raised his hand, then another, but the rest of the hands stayed down. Richard's eyes widened. He spun around. What are you doing? Johnson! Davies! Raise your hands! It's free money! Johnson looked down at the table. Davies adjusted his tie and looked away. The motion fails, Henderson said calmly. No, Richard shrieked. You can't do this. I have a counter-motion, Henderson continued, ignoring him. I move to ratify the last will and testament of Maddox Sterling and to appoint James Bennett as the executive chairwoman of Sterling Industries, effective immediately. Seconded, said a woman at the end of the table, the CFO. All in favor? Henderson asked. Henderson raised his hand. The CFO raised hers. Then, one by one, like dominoes falling in reverse, hands went up all around the table. Even the men who had looked at her with suspicion 10 minutes ago were now voting for her. It was unanimous. Richard Sterling stood there, trembling, his face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a ghost. He had lost. The shark had been swallowed by the ocean he thought he ruled. This isn't over, Richard hissed at James, grabbing his briefcase. I'll sue. I'll tie this up in court for years. You can try, Richard, Robert Halloway spoke up from beside James, his voice dripping with satisfaction. But considering you just tried to force a sale against the wishes of the majority shareholder, I'd suggest you save your legal fees. You're going to need them. Security, Henderson said into the intercom. Please escort Mr. Richard Sterling from the building. His clearance is revoked. 2 large security guards entered the room. Richard looked at them, then at James. He opened his mouth to say something cruel, something to hurt her, but he found he had nothing left. He turned and stormed out, the heavy doors closing behind him with a final, resonant thud. The room was quiet again. But it wasn't the heavy silence of before. It was a lighter, cleaner silence. James let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 3 days. Her knees felt weak. She sank into the chair. Maddox's chair. It was too big for her, the leather cool against her back. Mr. Henderson stood up and extended a hand across the table. Welcome to the board, Madam Chairwoman, he said, a genuine smile breaking through his stoic face. I believe we have a lot of work to do. James shook his hand. She felt the diary in her purse, pressing against her side. Yes, James smiled, tears finally spilling over. We do. But first, does anyone know where the coffee machine is? I think we're going to need a fresh pot. For the first time in 20 years, laughter filled the boardroom of Sterling Industries. Maddox Sterling was gone, but his promise had been kept, and the waitress who had tipped the scales with a slice of pie was just getting started. James's story is a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. Maddox Sterling spent a lifetime building an empire, but in the end, he realized that his greatest legacy wasn't his money. It was finding someone with a heart, pure enough to care for others when no one was watching. In a world where we are often told to look out for number one, James teaches us that kindness is the ultimate strength. She tipped the scales not with vengeance, but with dignity. It makes you think, doesn't it? How many times have we walked past someone like Maddox, judging them by their coat instead of their character? If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell.